lots of NIH grants under her belt. And it's very interesting because I'm bringing you different perspectives on this problem of prevention of sexual abuse. And Mary talked primarily, not exclusively, about what we call the hardening the target kind of intervention, and that is teaching kids that they can say no, teaching kids about sexual abuse, and making them harder targets. Elizabeth talks about that as well, but extends this into, prevention of kids who have sexually offended, and talking about healthy boundaries and healthy sexuality in slightly older kids. And Elizabeth has one of the first NIH grants to take a program like this into the middle schools. So with that, I'm going to introduce Dr. Letourneau.
Thank you, Jenny. Morning, everybody. Hi. It's great to be back here at Penn State with my friends and to get a chance to talk with you a little bit about the work that my colleagues and I are doing at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and at the Moore Center for the Prevention of Child Sexual Abuse. Today, I want to tell you a story about why I believe child sexual abuse perpetration is preventable, and specifically a preventable public health problem. We tend to view it, as I'll describe a little bit more, as pretty much solely a criminal justice problem, and I think we need to expand that lens, and I think we can. And so I'm going to take you through a discussion of why and how we might target youth perpetration of child sexual abuse, why I think that's an important area to focus on. Before I get started, I want to talk a little bit about language. We often talk about child molesters and predators and perpetrators and sex offenders, and this language is pejorative when we apply it to children. Just the word juvenile is actually a pejorative term. We know when we talk about juveniles, most of us start thinking about offenders and kids who are really bad. And when we talk about juvenile sex offenders, we being the public, really start thinking about kids who are irredeemable. And so we need to, I think, really think very hard about the language that we use when we're talking about kids who engage in harmful or illegal behaviors, and particularly harmful or illegal sexual behaviors. So I'm trying to change the way I speak. As an associate editor of one of the main journals in this, I was able to put forward new standards that focus on person-first language to remind us that we are talking about kids when we talk about these children. And I would also encourage all of you to think about when you're talking about kids who have engaged in harmful or illegal sexual behaviors, if you can challenge yourselves to avoid some of these labels. I cite a paper up here that just came out in the journal Sexual Abuse, a Journal of Research and Treatment, by my friends Andy Harris and Kelly Socia, and they actually did a survey of about 1,000 people, and half of them got 5 phrases that had the term sex offender or juvenile sex offender, and half got a term, a rather complicated term, youth who has committed crimes of a sexual nature, and found evidence for what we more or less already knew, which is that when you talk about juvenile sex offenders, people begin to endorse very extreme kinds of policies with these kids and begin to lose hope about these kids. So, something to think about. I'm often faced by people who really don't believe child sexual abuse is preventable. They ask me, and this includes people who are in agencies where the word prevention is in the name. The Office of Juvenile Justice, Delinquency, and Prevention has been a strong partner with me in my research and with the field, and is moving much more towards prevention of juvenile offending by kids. But even folks in that department have approached me and said, I don't really think child sexual abuse is something we can prevent. And I think that stems from many sources. There has been some communications research that indicates that people really believe sex offenders to be kind of monsters, very qualitatively different from us, people who really can't be rehabilitated and whose behaviors can't be predicted. And if you don't think you can predict something, then you can't prevent that thing. And it's hard for people to envision what would prevention look like. Toward the end of my talk, I'm going to give you one example of a program that we believe may help in the prevention of child sexual abuse perpetration. But it is a challenge for people to consider what might this look like. And so what I like to say is that, there was a time when child car seats were not even invented, and a time after they were invented, actually by someone at Johns Hopkins, where they weren't the standard. And now they're the standard. Nobody puts a kid in a car without putting that child in a car seat. It's an easy, obvious solution to a serious problem, which was the death and injury children endured from vehicle collisions. We came up with a solution to that, and now it seems very obvious, but it was not obvious back at the time. So I think there's a lot of examples where we faced wide-scale problems that affected so many of us. And we didn't have solutions, and we developed them, and now they seem pretty easy and obvious. And I don't think all the solutions to child sexual abuse will be easy or obvious, but I think some might be. And again, I'll get to one of those. The world is coming around to the idea that this is a preventable public health problem. The World Health Organization has designated child sexual abuse as one of just 24 risk factors that it's identified as substantively contributing to the global burden of disease. And of course, there's more than 24 things that impact the global burden of disease, but when they were looking for which risk factors to really dive deep on, they wanted ones that were clearly linked to illness, injury, and mental health problems, and were clearly preventable, and that is the case for child sexual abuse. And now we see more and more organizations, agencies, and experts coming on board. These are just several who in the past 5 years have reached the conclusion that child sexual abuse is a preventable public health problem. For the most part, we've tended to view child sexual abuse as a social problem, something that happens to some unfortunate children, with a criminal justice solution. And we have, to be quite fair, achieved quite a bit under this framework. We have primarily feminists to thank for bringing rape out of the shadows in the 70s and 80s, and quickly on the heels of that, they brought child sexual abuse out of the shadows. And because of their efforts and because of victims advocates and the policymakers that were willing to work with them, we have a safety net of shelters. We have increased awareness among the public, among policymakers, that child sexual abuse is in fact out there and that it causes real harm. And we've had the development of evidence-based interventions for victims, like trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy, trauma-focused CBT, which has been validated in more than a dozen randomized controlled trials all across the world. We've had, on the criminal justice side, some improvements as well, clear demarcations that sex with children by adults is illegal. That's a very clear demarcation. We have had increased, not just increased consequences, but increased certainty of consequences. We've had excellent advances in risk assessment for adults, and we've had advances in treatment for people who have engaged in harmful and illegal sexual behaviors. And in fact, we have seen massive declines in the rates of child sexual abuse since 1990. These declines have been steady, and they're there if you look at arrest data, they're there if you look at child welfare reports, and they're there if you look at surveys of victims. So these are real declines, and I think that a lot contributes to that. We have far to go. We do still have child sexual abuse, of course, but we have far less of it, and we have far more reporting of it than we have ever had since we've begun measuring these things. I would argue that the reporting is in large part due to the efforts of people like Mary and programs like Safe Touches, where they have destigmatized child sexual abuse victimization and made it more possible for people to talk about this. But there's obvious limits to viewing child sexual abuse as solely a criminal justice problem. This obviously directs resources to after-the-fact responses. And many of those responses are actually not very helpful. And I'm going to take just a minute to tell you about one area of research that I've been engaged in for about 15 years. It's not the topic for today's talk, but I do want to talk about what I mean by unhelpful responses. One of the things that I've been doing research on is sex offender registration and public notification. These are federal policies that began in 1994 and that apply to juveniles, to children who have engaged in harmful and illegal sexual behaviors. And so what my colleagues and I have been doing in a program of research is really evaluating what's the effects of sex offender registration and notification when you apply those policies to children. And I can tell you from multiple published studies that involve data from now 6 states that juvenile registration notification does not reduce recidivism, does not reduce first-time sex offending, does increase the likelihood that a case will be dropped or dismissed or pled to a non-sex offense case. We've talked with prosecutors about that and judges, and they say it's because they don't want kids facing lifetime registration. We've just finished a study that's not yet out in publication where we looked at kids who are in treatment for having engaged in harmful sexual behavior. So all of the kids, 256 children ages 12 to 17, who are in treatment for having engaged in harmful sexual behavior, and about 30% of them were subjected to some form of registration requirement. The kids subjected to registration were more likely to be Black. They were more likely to be sexual orientation minorities, sexual minorities. They reported massive increases in having attempted suicide in the past 30 days. The odds ratio was 4.0, 400% increase in the likelihood that these kids would report having attempted suicide in the past 30 days. And they also had an odds 4 times that of kids not registered of having been approached by an adult for sex in the past year. So registration and notification is a policy that enjoys universal support. When you do surveys of the public, there's strong, strong, strong support for these policies, but they do nothing to improve community safety, and they carry with them very, very real risks for the kids that they're subjected to. So that's, I think, another reason why we really have to look at how we handle child sexual abuse. The harm, the potential for harm to victims is well understood, and I would argue that there's a very strong potential for harm to the children and the teenagers that engage in these behaviors. We can do better than this. We can do better than waiting for kids to misbehave before we try to attempt to prevent those behaviors. Mary presented Safe Touches and the work that she and her organization have been doing with that. And I would say that that is the highest quality work. It certainly encourages a lot of good. And it may be the case that if they are able to get the grants and get the large sample sizes, which when you have a whole country behind you, that might happen, or a whole state like New York, to look at whether this reduces the likelihood that kids are victimized. But so far, the research that's been done suggests while we can encourage kids to disclose, we can increase their knowledge of child abuse and neglect and child sexual abuse in particular, and we can reduce self-blame, which is a really important component and a really important outcome. So far, the research suggests that when we do these kind of target hardening, we're not reducing the likelihood that children will be victimized. It's not to say that it won't happen, and it's not to say that it's not important to keep engaging in these activities, but this alone does not seem to be enough to reduce the likelihood that kids actually experience child sexual abuse. And so I think we need to broaden our lens again to to include perpetration prevention efforts. And I think there's some good evidence that indicates that we can have a real impact if we start thinking about how do we stop people from engaging in child sexual abuse behaviors in the first place. There are a couple of primary prevention programs that I'm going to talk about, and then David Wolf is going to talk about one after the break, I believe. So I'll present two briefly, and then that address peer-on-peer sexual harassment and sexual violence. They don't address peer on younger kid behavior, which is what our study we hope will add to this. And there's also evidence that if you target kids with treatment, kids who are at risk of engaging in harmful sexual behaviors or who already have, you can reduce that risk and you can reduce recidivism. And that too suggests to us that if you can stop it from happening again, perhaps you could have stopped it from happening in the first place if you had the right prevention programming in place. So briefly, as I mentioned, there's two, more than two, but these are two well-validated primary prevention and also universal prevention. Primary means it prevents kids from engaging in these behaviors in the first place. And both of these interventions, shifting boundaries and safe dates, target peer-on-peer sexual harassment and sexual violence with slightly different curricula and procedures. And so they're both target primary prevention, trying to get kids not to engage in those kinds of behaviors for the first time. And they're universal in the sense that they're applied in an entire school, and they target 6th, 7th, and 8th graders depending on the intervention. Shifting boundaries is, I think, less well known among people in our field. It's undergone a 30-school randomized controlled trial, also in New York. Bruce Taylor and Nan Stein and their colleagues developed the intervention in Cleveland, actually, and then shifted over to New York for their big trial. And it has just a 6-session curricula that targets 6th and 7th graders with information on what's legal, so they know what's legal and what's not. They include a focus on consent. And a few other things, but it also has a building-wide intervention. And the building-wide intervention for shifting boundaries, I think, is quite novel and interesting. And what they do is they have kids identify hot spots, places where bad behavior happens. And then the school does something about that. At minimum, the school might post a poster in the hot spot, a stairwell, a bathroom, the cafeteria, places out around the playground. Post a poster that reminds students of good behavior and what to do if they see bad behavior. At best, they place an adult in the hotspot. And it turns out if you put an adult in the hotspot, the bad behavior goes away. So you increase supervision, adult supervision and monitoring, kids shape right up. In fact, that intervention all by itself reduced peer-on-peer sexual harassment and sexual violence perpetration, even without the 6-session curricula. Safe Dates is a program that was developed by Vanjie Foshi and her colleagues, and it's been validated in a couple of randomized controlled trials, and it targets slightly older kids, 8th and 9th graders, who are in dating relationships, as the name implies. And again, they've been able to show reductions in peer-on-peer sexual violence, as well as physical violence, both perpetration and victimization. So these are two very, very promising programs that indicate that we can get kids to change their behavior, including their sexual behaviors. This next study is an example of secondary prevention. This is where there was a group of kids that might have been at risk of engaging in harmful sexual behaviors because as children, 12 and under, they were characterized by severe sexual behavior problems. So these are sexual behavior problems that don't desist, don't stop when a parent or a teacher has intervened a couple of times. And so Mark Chaffin, who's no longer with us, Jane Solovsky, and their then student Melissa Carpentier, took a sample of kids who had been involved in a randomized controlled trial of the Oklahoma intervention for child sexual behavior problems. And they followed these kids up for 10 years. And what they found is that the kids who had gotten the family-focused cognitive behavior therapy intervention were no more likely to have committed harmful or illegal sexual behavior than another group of kids who had come into the same clinics with anxiety disorders. So the kids with sexual behavior problems were no more likely over a 10-year period of time to have engaged in harmful sexual behaviors than a group of kids who were not at risk for engaging in harmful sexual behaviors, kids that needed help with anxiety. That's the functional definition of a cure. If you can get your at-risk group to look like a not at-risk group, then you're done. That's the functional definition of a cure. So that's a really important study that again suggests we can take kids who may have been at increased risk and reduce that risk. And indeed, the kids who got the control intervention, which was a directed play therapy, about 10% of them went on to commit harmful sexual behaviors. So this was further validation for the Oklahoma CSBP intervention. And then this last piece of evidence comes to us from multisystemic therapy for problem sexual behaviors, and this is tertiary prevention. So these are kids who have engaged in harmful illegal sexual behaviors and who we want to reduce their recidivism risk. And if we can reduce recidivism, that's tertiary, that's the end, that's the last point for prevention, right? And 3 different randomized control trials have supported this family-focused intervention as being able to reduce the risk of sexual recidivism, non-sexual recidivism, risky sexual behaviors, substance use, and out-of-home placements. And out-of-home placements is where we start getting at your pocketbook. If you can reduce that while keeping kids safe in their communities, then you've got a cost-effective as well as a clinically effective intervention. So again, what this shows us is we can reduce peer-on-peer sexual misbehavior. We can reduce the likelihood of sexual risk posed by kids that are at risk, and we can reduce sexual recidivism rates of kids who have already gone down this road. What we haven't done yet is we don't have any research that I'm aware of that looks at whether we can reduce the likelihood of kids engaging younger children in inappropriate, harmful, or illegal sexual behaviors. And here's why we want to focus on that. About half of children who experienced sexual abuse in prepubescence under the age of 12, about half of all of those victims were victimized by another kid. So children cause about half of the sexual harm against other children. And so we really need to start thinking, what are we going to do about this? Besides just putting these kids in prison and then on a lifetime sex offender registry, can we do better than that? Can we do more than that? Importantly, these behaviors are transient and modifiable. So when a kid engages a younger child in sexual abuse, it is not because he's an incipient pedophile or she's an incipient predator or psychopath. For the most part, there's very modifiable reasons that I'll get into in just a moment. And there's some other evidence that supports that. The peak age of a child offending against a younger child is 14, and then you see a very stiff decline. That peak age, that's the peak age for your lifespan. For anyone to offend against a younger child, the peak age is 14. It's not 24, it's not 34, it's not 44. It's 14 years of age. You get this sharp peak and then a sharp decline. And we think that's because a lot of these kids just don't know any better. They play with younger kids, they hang out with younger kids. People have told them not to hurt or punch or tease younger kids, but nobody has told them, and don't touch a younger kid's penis or don't touch a younger kid's vagina. We don't tell kids this. So I think that's one of the reasons. Relative to adults who commit sex offenses, the offenses committed by kids are, as you can see on there, lower severity. This is not to say that kids do not cause harm. And this is not to minimize the harm that is felt by the children that are victimized by other children. But when we do these comparisons, we do see differences that strongly support the idea that this behavior is in fact modifiable and transient. And then I think one really important piece of information to have is that sexual recidivism almost never occurs once a kid has been caught. So as I said, we have data, my colleagues and I, from multiple states across a 15-year period of time